Hi, thank you for joining us today as part of the UC South Coast Research and Extension Center's virtual Avocado Festival. My name is Jason Suppies, and I'm a community educator here at South Coast. I'm joined by my co-community educator and co-host, Tammy Majerek. This is the first time we've hosted a webinar with a live studio audience, and there's a few folks out there who are just now being introduced to the work here at South Coast. So just a quick background for our visitors. South Coast Research and Extension Center is one of 9 ag, horticultural, and natural resource research centers operated by the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources. We've been in operation since 1956 and serve as an outdoor laboratory of sorts for a wide range of ag and horticultural research. To learn more about the UC Riverside Avocado Germplasm Collection and the history of breeding research in California located here, please check out our video and audio only link to researcher Eric Folks by visiting ceorange.ucanr.edu/Avocado Festival. So I think I've done enough talking about us. Let's get into the reason you're here today and our presentation. We're joined by Mr. Paul Spitzzeri. Paul Spitzzeri is the director at the Workman and Temple Family Homestead Museum, where he's worked since 1988. He has a bachelor's and master's in history from California State University, Fullerton, and has written on California history for such journals as the California History Journal, Southern California Quarterly, California Legal History, and Journal of the West, and in the anthologies Law in the Western United States, Encyclopedia of Immigration and Migration in the America West, and Icons of the American West. His biography on the Workman and Temple families is an Award of Merit winner from the American Association for State and Local History. Paul's presentation today, The Hanging Gardens of Babylon in Southern California, is a deep dive into the world of Edwin G. Hart's influence locally on the avocado. To our audience, if you have any questions during the presentation, please type those into the chat pod on your screen. And if we're unable to answer your inquiry today, Paul will be giving out his information at the end so we can follow up with you. With no further ado, let's welcome Paul Spitzzeri. Paul, thanks so much for joining us today. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Tammy, and it's a great pleasure to be part of this virtual Avocado Festival.
Thank you.
So, Hanging Gardens of Babylon in Southern California came from a 1920 newspaper article talking about the way that avocados were being grown in the region. At that time, the fruit was not widely known. It was considered something of a novelty by most people. It was sometimes referred to, maybe a little bit derisively, as an alligator pear because of the skin of the fruit. But thanks to Edwin Hart and others, it became better known during the time period that I'll be dealing with, which is roughly 1910 to 1930. Hart was not only an avid avocado supporter and grower, he was a real estate developer. So he combined those two talents into creating what I guess would call the avocado subdivisions or tracts of North Whittier Heights and La Habra Heights, both of which are adjacent and very close to the Homestead Museum where I work. We are in City of Industry, and these two communities are just to the south of us. So, as I said, the alligator pear was seen as something of an unusual fruit. Again, not widely utilized in these days. This did come from a Los Angeles newspaper from the 1920s for a tomato avocado cocktail. So while you're looking, you can see it's not a lot of ingredients, not particularly complicated to do, but if you want that screenshot, let me know. I've got my email at the end. I'll be happy to send it over to anybody who wants to try out that cocktail. Of course, by cocktail, we're talking about a non-alcoholic drink. It's more of a food thing. Now, there was a California Avocado Growers Association that was established in 1915. In this article, I'll highlight it here, they actually called themselves the California Aguacate Growers Association, the aguacate being the Spanish word. And by the 1920s, mid part of the decade, they had come up with a brand, kind of like what the orange growers did with Sunkist. In this case, the brand became Calvo. and that's how it was known. And they really tried hard to actually eliminate the use of the word avocado and get people to only think of it as Calvo, and that never really took hold. But that was just showing within 10 years how they were really starting to try to establish something more professional, more formal, and brand the fruit for the general public. Edwin Hart was born in 1874. This is a passport photo of him. He was from Cleveland, Ohio, where his father, who came from German ancestry, was a music teacher and professor at the local music conservatory. His mother was from British descent, and there were several children. He had 2 brothers, and there was also a nephew in the household. So on this 1880 census down here is the family. John J. Hart, it says teacher and principal of the Conservatory of Music, and his wife. Older son, John W. Hart, who was also very heavily involved in the avocado industry with his brother. Eddie, or Edward. There was a baby who died shortly after that. And then there was, down at the bottom is a nephew, Frank Hart, who came to Southern California with the family and actually wound up becoming an owner of a very prominent music company, Southern California Music Company in Los Angeles. But what happened was the family did what so many people did in the 1880s. They migrated west to Los Angeles. The Transcontinental Railroad was being built to this area at that time. People often came out for health reasons, tuberculosis, for example. They would go to the foothills of the San Gabriel Valley where there would be sanitarium and other environments where they could try to better their health. And it may have been that brought the Hart family out. They purchased property, about 40 acres in a little town called Sierra Madre, built a home, planted vineyards, had a winery. Monte Vina was the name that they chose for the product that they produced. There's a structure that was associated with the ranch that is still in a city park called Memorial Park, but for a long time known as Hart Park. And it's now sort of a senior center there. This is the 1900 census, and at the top is Edwin G. Hart at the age of 25 when he is still considering himself a winemaker. But within a few years, he would change his profession. And that was to go into real estate. So he was a member of the Los Angeles Realty Association. He would join that in 1904. This is the article talking about his listing for that. And he had many different early projects, including his hometown. The Sierra Madre Realty Company was his project. But he also did development in places like Glendale, as you can see here. And a place called San Marino, which was a ranch owned by a guy named Shorb back in the 19th century. Shorb had married Benjamin D. Wilson, an early citizen of Los Angeles. The Wilson Observatory, Mount Wilson Observatory was named for him. San Marino didn't exist as a city yet, but Henry E. Huntington, who was one of the most prominent figures in Los Angeles in the first years of the 20th century, built a massive streetcar system called the Pacific Electric, and also a lot of development, was really a founding father of San Marino. But Edwin Hart was along with that. He was one of the first realtors to set up shop there. He also lived a long time in San Marino, and his home is now the site of the city public library there, right off Huntington Drive. Hart, over time, began to build his business, and one of his dreams, evidently, was to try to create something that would be not just a subdivision, but also emphasize agriculture in a big way. When he was younger, he spent quite a bit of time in Mexico, and that's where the avocado came into his consciousness, and he and a few others began to grow the fruit to try to promote it. And like I said, in 1915, to create that Growers Association. Just before that happened, just before the association was launched, he developed what was called North Whittier Heights, now known as Hacienda Heights, an unincorporated area of Los Angeles County. So this is a little bit north of Whittier, a little bit south of La Puente and West Covina. The 60 freeway runs along the north there. It's in the Puente Hills system on the northwest corner of that. And as you can see here in this article, they're talking about the idea, this is 1913, that budded avocado trees would be planted on most of the property. They were really pushing this. But they were also talking about citrus, because obviously the orange, the lemon, the grapefruit were all big crops, especially oranges, to some degree lemons. And there was talking also about trying to do field crops, tomatoes, bell peppers, beans, corn, all kinds of stuff that could be done in the property, depending on what part of the topography, of course, that you're dealing with, because those steeper slopes would be a lot better for raising avocados as opposed to what you could do on the lowlands or the flatlands of the property. a lot of what had been in that area, and again, this is mostly in the flatter sections, were fields of barley. A lot of this land had been owned by a guy named Lucky Baldwin, who was kind of famous in the 19th century as a mining figure, got involved in a lot of real estate development here in this area. He owned thousands of acres of the Rancho La Puente, much of which encompassed North Whittier Heights. Our museum is one of the headquarters of the original rancho from the 1840s. And the Workman family that owned our site lost most of their land to Baldwin in a failure of a bank called Temple and Workman back in the 1870s. When Baldwin died in 1909, that opened up a huge amount of land for development as his estate sold off a lot of property. So the city of Baldwin Park, for example, was created during that time. As they got ready in May 1913 to have the grand opening for the Tracts, you can see how they would use certain kinds of symbols and visual images to try to promote these types of projects. And this is kind of an interesting one. You've got a Mexican caballero on horseback, lassoing a grizzly bear. Grizzlies were basically extinct about this time anyway. But in the back appear to be, I don't know, the gold miners or what that is. You see orange groves and the hills and all that. So these were kind of typical themes you'd see. Real Mexican barbecue. This was a common feature of a lot of these developments all over Southern California during those years. And had a special train chartered from the Salt Lake Railway. This is now the Union Pacific line that goes to the southern part of the San Gabriel Valley. And Hart was the general sales agent for the owners, the Whittier Extension Company, and there were other agents selling property there as well. Another early ad, I think probably from about 1914, where they're telling you it's not that far from Los Angeles, easy to get to, and you can grow orange, lemon, avocado, and walnuts as an investment, and also a suburban home. So a lot of this was really being promoted as not your primary residence, perhaps, but you're a gentleman farmer or gentlewoman farmer, perhaps, and you could have your tract out in the country and not necessarily live on the property full time. And again, just other examples of what was being done with this development. In the very early days, again, avocado was not widely known when this was being done, but that was one of Hart's goals. And this is a quote from him, I think about 1916, where he says, "Hardly any productive industry has ever started with so complete an organization and such a general determination to make it succeed as that of the avocado growers." Now, I suppose the orange growers and lemon growers might beg to differ with him, but he also says that there's no spot in the entire world or the whole planet better adapted to that than Los Angeles. Now, how he would know that, I don't know, but he certainly had a lot of experience looking in Mexico as well as in broader Southern California. And he talked about this new association that he was part of, having an education program to have distribution of the fruit in markets and try to get the public to be better aware of what was going on with the development of the avocado. And again, just kind of fun to see these different ads back then. So some of them would specifically say, this is avocado land. This is prime property for that kind of thing. Others may be more general about having a suburban home site outside of Los Angeles. And again, good example here, buy one of these splendid avocado orchards for your income or your country home. Only 45 minutes from 7th and Broadway. 3 or 4 months ago, it would take you 45 minutes just to get from there to the 605 freeway, probably heading into Los Angeles, but that was a long time ago. And they even enlisted some people from Hollywood. So this is an actress named Georgia Hale, not well known today, but she was out there holding up the avocado to lend a little, I guess, sex appeal to what was being done with the promotion of the fruit. So again, that association being launched, and you can see on the left here, they say again, alligator pears will be topic of interest at this first meeting that they had, or one of the first meetings in 1915. And Hart is the president at that time. So he's quoted as explaining what it is they wanted to do to promote and market the fruit to the general public. They had some registry set up so they could have the different varieties sort of listed. At that time, they said there were more than 100. This again is about 1916 when they were doing this. Within a couple of years, there were articles coming out, not that often, but fairly often, about how avocado was becoming a little more popular among growers too, as hopefully high value cash crop. I should point out, by the way, in this middle article about the registration committee, if you look down at the bottom, H.M. Haldeman, he was the father of the Haldeman who was President Nixon's chief of staff during the infamous era of Watergate. This is the article I mentioned before from 1920, Babylon's Hanging Gardens, brought down to date the whole idea that the development of the avocado, and the photos are specifically from North Whittier Heights. You obviously can't see them very well. This is a panorama showing the area. There's a specific one of a couple of trees and what have you, but they were talking about how this is, when you hear hanging gardens, you almost get an idea like it's an exotic type of thing, not so commonplace yet, but they were trying to work on that. That led Hart to his next big project with North Whittier Heights, doing pretty well as it was. He was able to acquire a large property, Rancho La Habra, from a guy named Hale, who had been an agriculturist of some note, especially out in Riverside. And so Hart acquired this property, and the La Habra Heights company was then created, about 3,000 acres to be able to start to subdivide, and again, really promote the avocado as well as other things. By 1920, they were starting to sell tracts of land, including to the Hacienda Country Club. So one of the big projects along with this was a golf course to try to attract upper income buyers. And again, it's the same kind of idea. I don't think they were anticipating there'd be a ton of people living there full time, but probably the sort of the country farm type of thing. I was able to get in contact with some people in the Harbor Heights not that long ago, within the last month, and they loaned a couple of photographs to show some of the development. If you know this area at all and you drive out there, it'd be kind of hard to imagine these flat rolling hills, because you see a lot of trees up there. There still are avocados in many places. There are still some citrus being grown in a few spots here and there, but quite a bit of difference over the last century, obviously. And again, with the promotion of the Harbor Heights, it's a lot of the same stuff we saw with North Whittier Heights. Commercial avocado orchard being one of the most attractive investments in horticulture, agriculture. The tracts being sold from 1 to 50 acres. You can see the price range, $275 to $1,350 per acre. We also will contract to plant or care for orchards for those who wish to have us do so. So that's an interesting thing too, not very common in real estate development at all, where a person, again, maybe they're sort of an absentee owner, they've got an avocado grove, and they'll contract with a company to manage this for them. Grover T. Russell was the main agent for Edwin Hart over in North Whittier Heights. And so he just transitioned over to also assist with the development of La Habra Heights as well. La Habra Heights, the home of the avocado, not just a subdivision, but a great horticultural project with avocado groves and suburban homes. They talk about the protection of the foothills. You've got drainage. There's not damaging frost. Sometimes have those, pretty rarely. Every tract is going to tell you why they're better than everybody else and why nothing bad ever happens in these places. But here you can see some examples of that specifically with this project. One of my favorites is the Grand Canyon of the avocado. And it came evidently from a woman, a visitor of artistic temperament, as she overlooked the property, probably from one of the upper elevations, obviously. And I'm sure Edwin Hart loved when he heard about that, decided to include it in his promotion. And you can see how they're talking about scientific terracing, the choosing of nursery stock, having that all-important water line because of the irrigation. Obviously, avocados take a very large amount of water, and it helped that the Los Angeles Aqueduct was brought in 1913, and other water projects were being developed during the 1920s, including what was going to come with the Colorado River project as well. And again, great ones. Start seeing a little bit of Art Deco by the late 20s. So you've got the pretty avocado grove, talking about how much money you could make per acre. And so they say, well, Mr. Holloway's got 2.5 acres with 6-year-old trees, and he had made $5,500 this year, which is a pretty substantial amount of money for the late 1920s. But they're kind of juxtaposing that or complementing that sometimes with the idea, again, of having your country home out there. And there were evidently people from Los Angeles, including a few people in the Hollywood film industry who had properties. Over in North Whittier Heights, there was a prominent banker from LA that they promoted a lot as having one of his country properties. And again, here you are again. This is Holloway, probably him standing with his boxes of avocados by his trees, but he made $7,212 from 3 acres in 1928. So he had a better year, I guess, than what we saw with the earlier one. And sometimes you see combined marketing because, again, Hart's behind both of these. So the idea that you can start over, have your life begin all over again. And for some reason, they've now windowed the time down from 45 minutes to 40 minutes to get from 7th and Broadway all the way out by Whittier Boulevard to State Highway. out to these two communities. And again, they're telling you you can make plenty of money and give you examples of how that happens with some specific figures. Hart also branched out into San Diego County. So one of his projects was the community of Vista. There were avocados being done at Encinitas, up in Fallbrook. And again, you can drive obviously down Interstate 15 and still see some of that as you're heading south from Temecula down towards San Diego. So he was definitely expanding his eye in a greater geographical area in terms of promoting these communities, being central to all of that. And one of the big things that was being promoted, especially in the farm and garden section, or farm and tractor section, I guess it says here, of the Los Angeles Times, was how the process and the growing of these crops was being implemented and improved upon, and the development of UC's agricultural department and what was being done at Davis, and the extensions that were taking place down here. Santa Monica Mountains had one. There was one in Chino that later moved to Riverside and became UC Riverside. A lot of money being invested in scientific study and experimentation, and then propagating that information to farmers. And that could be done through the mass media as well as through circulars and other content being generated specifically by UC and other academic and professional organizations and entities. So here you've got an article about hillside cultivation and irrigation. They show you pictures of how they're doing the terracing and able to provide the water for these trees. It's really kind of fascinating to see how some of that was being done. And again, kind of the hanging gardens thing was being brought into that as well. And how important, obviously, irrigation is going to be. You can kind of get an inkling just from these images here of how they're doing the irrigation on these steep hillsides. Not like the orange groves, which would be on your lowland areas and more flat locations for the most part, and a little bit easier to work on irrigation in those environments, obviously, as opposed to the hillsides. By about 1925-26 is when the Avocado Growers Association decides to again, follow the lead of Sunkist and try to create this brand of Calvo, California's butterfruit, as that was starting to be referred to. So again, a lot of attention being put into the professionalization of not just the growing, but also the marketing and promotion and sale of the fruit. There's some photos from the newspaper. So they've got the Calvo name on all the crates, and the employees are wearing coats that have the name on it. You can see here that they're doing the grading along the conveyor belts. And then once the fruit is packed, it's being stored in these coolers until it can be shipped out. Calvo had its packing plant not in North Whittier Heights or La Habra Heights area, but actually in downtown Los Angeles, in what's called the Central Manufacturing District, a little bit south and east there of downtown, along the Los Angeles River, but also more importantly along the railroad lines that terminated and brought a lot of material in and out of Los Angeles for the surrounding areas. But again, you got to try to have a little bit of broader appeal. So you see a lot of these images, doesn't matter if it's oranges, lemons, walnuts, avocados, is the attractive young woman posed with the fruit. You can see she's being shown, not that she probably cared that much about what the grading was being done for these avocados, but you can get a little feel for how some of this was being done. Dolling up for the trade. So again, this is all part of this movement by the later part of the 1920s to ramp up the way they can market and promote the fruit. And again, see more examples of this. So the growing, the packing, the marketing, all being talked about. The LA Times was very, very important in this. They were a large media presence. The publishers were very tied politically and economically to the elite in the area, Chamber of Commerce and all of that. So they had a lot of pull and were able to help promote a lot of this for the avocado growers, as they would do for the orange growers, lemon growers, walnut growers, et cetera. Another big part of the promotional effort was the development of a regional avocado show. This started in the early to mid-1920s, held out in Whittier. They had a field off of Whittier Boulevard, a little southwest of downtown, and they would put up these large tents. You can get a little indication of that from some of these images here. And the event just grew as each passing year went along, and they made a big show of obviously trying to promote that going from a certain number of exhibits and a certain number of visitors to a much larger contingent of those over time was being heavily promoted. And again, the idea was that Hart was not only had a Los Angeles office as his main headquarters, but he had an office in Whittier for his developments. So he's able to promote both the avocado as well as his own real estate projects. Again, you can see the Calvo name down here on the bottom right. Another advertisement for the show. I think this is probably 1928. And again, they just got bigger and bigger. So they would have larger exhibits. They would have vaudeville performances and bands and all that sort of thing. So it really grew dramatically as the 20s progressed. And again, just a lot more discussion in the media about how to market the crop and make it more interesting to people. It was talked about as a superfood, a term that we use a lot these days. And so they were trying to promote that too. It took a little while for people to become acclimated to it in the same way. Now, it'll be one thing for local interest, consumption, knowledge of it, but spreading it across the country is a whole different situation. It wasn't that much before this, maybe 40 or 50 years, that the orange was considered a novelty. And so it just takes time for those things to happen. This is a long article by Edwin Hart where he's talking as a land authority about how for avocado and citrus, there was just seemingly no end to what could be done. This is 1929. And this view is of what was called the Elliott Grove. John M. Elliott was a big-time banker in Los Angeles. He had a very large property. So they loved to promote that because it showed a pretty impressive system of terracing. And Elliott was very wealthy. He could afford to do this on a pretty large scale. There was a guy up in Glendora named Charles Silent. He was a judge and attorney, very prominent in LA in the late 19th century. He and his children were also involved in avocado raising in the foothills of Glendora. So again, on a large scale, some of these people, of course, would have the capital to be able to do that. Hart celebrated his 25th anniversary as a realtor, and being the skilled marketing and PR guy that he was, he made sure that his story was being brought out to the public. So a newspaper article about how when he came here as a boy and he built up his development over time. And it said that he had 7,700 acres that were being marketed under his supervision. A lot of that, again, being avocado properties that we've talked about in North Whittier Heights and La Habra Heights as well. And what this article talks about is he came at 9 years old. He was supervisor for his father's holdings, but later went to southern Mexico to study citrus and land conditions. Doesn't talk about avocados, but that had to be where he got his initial exposure to that. And we're probably talking at the end of the 19th century, maybe the very first years of the 20th century, because he came back, it says here, from Mexico in 1904 to get into real estate. And as a result, here you go. As a result of his activities in Mexico, he was instrumental in promoting interest in avocados as a commercially valuable crop in Southern California. So again, he had a tremendous involvement in all of this. This is Hart here. Not sure who the other gentleman is, standing by an avocado tree, probably in the Habra Heights, I would imagine. And he was certainly a crucial figure. And there were many others, but he was one of those. Another guy named Pocono, P-O-P-E-N-O-E, was a pretty prominent guy. The Pocono family also spent time in Mexico. One of them wound up being a very prominent eugenicist, controversial views about race and scientific development. But the Pocono family was also quite involved in the avocado and other agricultural endeavors in California in those days. Now, the 1929 enthusiasm as he celebrated his 25th anniversary, and there was talk that they could just keep growing and avocados would continue to be a bigger and bigger part of the local economy. That kind of went by the wayside in many ways when the Great Depression broke out at the end of 1929 and worsened as the early 1930s came about. So it isn't that the avocado went away, of course it didn't, but it didn't have the exponential growth that they were planning for as the Roaring 20s continued to roar for a certain period of time. Hart, however, did maintain an avid interest in his developments, in his work with avocados. In 1939, he was stepping out of his car in Los Angeles and was hit by a young driver who was arrested for negligent homicide. Hart died in the hospital shortly afterwards, but he was very well recognized. This is a Santa Ana newspaper, I think. This is 1939. A man who started avocado industry in the county, Orange County in this case, had passed away. So I hope you got a little flavor, pardon the pun, for how avocado history developed in our region through the work of Edwin G. Hart and his developments in what is now Hacienda Heights and La Habra Heights. And if you have any further questions or you'd like to see some of the images, please let me know. This is my email address. I'll leave it up on the screen so that you can write that down. And I want to thank again Jason and Tammy for the invitation to be part of the virtual Avocado Festival, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Thanks again.
Thank you, Paul. That was amazing, especially learning about the origin of Lucky Baldwin. It's taken me 25 years to learn that story.
Very good.
So yeah, thank you for that.
Sure.
You can check out Workman and Temple Family Museum at thehomesteadmuseum.com. Make sure to head over there and check them out. For video and audio only links to this presentation, researcher Eric Folk's presentation on history of varietal breeding in California, and our conversation with master gardener and California rare fruit grower Greg Rager, plus a list of links for avocado enthusiasts, home and new commercial growers. Check us out at ceorange.ucanr.edu/Avocado Festival, or by visiting us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at UC South Coast. Again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Paul, thanks again, and have a good night.